Senator Maladu.
Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me, although I think I'm in the unenviable position of following lunch and having to compete with a particularly good meal of oxtail. Three quick points on the matter of this bill, which I do support in its entirety. All of the amendments, etc., I think are necessary. Are they complete? Possibly not, but everything that's in there I support. But I just take this opportunity to mention a couple of things. Where to start? Firstly, my fellow Senator Hines, Dr. Hines, that sits here next to me, made a number of very good points, and I would like to reinforce one of them. Not all that I agree with, but I will reinforce one that I did. Firstly, I left Harrison College in 1982, having been studying math, physics, and chemistry, very focused, as you know, as Harrison College, that great institution on Crumpton Street, tends to do. I was surprised when I went to university in the United States that the subjects I was taking was quite wide, and one of those subjects was criminology. And I do remember a little bit from Professor Fife in criminology, who did teach me about the object of a sentence being of a criminal sentence or an incarceration or whatever you would call it, the punishment that you receive is 1, to punish, 2, to deter, 3, to rehabilitate, and in some cases to recompense. But where I would like to perhaps diverge a little bit from Senator Hines's comments is that under deter, there's 2 aspects of deter. There's specific deterrence and there's general deterrence. Now, I remember general deterrence very well because I had been all the way through Harrison College and never got flogged because I was afraid of being flogged. A flogging was a deterrent for me generally. If you wanted to have specific deterrence, you needed to be flogged, so you did not want to be flogged again, okay? So what I want to say on deterrence is there is absolutely no doubt that when you take a criminal and put them away for 20 years, they're not going to commit that crime. That is specific deterrence, okay? And let us not forget that in punishment, one of the main reasons for punishment is what we would call in the English language sometimes that that person has got their just deserts. They deserved it. They deserved to be punished. Let's not forget that when we talk about rehabilitation and all the other things that we need to do. And I think that this government has spent a proportionate amount of effort and needs to continue to do so to avoid the commitment of the crime never being committed at all. So that would be my first area of comments. However, when we were talking about that, others said, and I was deeply most concerned about this when it was said, Mr. President, that we started to compare ourselves, and someone said, we're not the worst in this area. Is this our new goal for Barbados, for this little Barbados that we live in? That we not be the worst? That other countries have higher death rates and murder rates than us? No, that's not, in my opinion, what I thought we were aiming for. Let us be the best. Let us not compare ourselves to the worst. We all faced that when we went home to mummy or granny or whoever and said, you know, I didn't come last in the class. Said, no, let me start with who came first. That's where you want to be. So I'm deeply concerned that if we are going to be starting to look at our murder rates on the basis of we're not the worst, that's not where I think we should go, Mr. President. And I guess that is a good lead into my second thing I wanted to talk about. In the 1990s, I can't remember exactly when, just after I came back from university and started to work, I had occasion to travel to Jamaica. And I would hear from my friends who would have been close to my age at that time, which would have been, I guess, mid-20s, something like that. The crime rate was very high, but they would say to me, don't worry, it's only in certain places, and it's only in certain people. Look at who is being killed. That's criminals killing criminals. And that was alien to me, and I didn't really hear the argument, and I don't need to spend a lot of time on where Jamaica went with that. But then, in about 2000, I started to travel to Trinidad, where I opened a business. And funny enough, the people I came across down there started telling me the same thing. The crime rate was increasing, there were murders, and they would tell me, listen, don't worry about it. There's no innocent person in that transaction. There is criminal killing criminals. And I would listen to it, and I would thought to myself, well, that's strange. I mean, that's what they say to each other. That's how they make themselves feel good, but it's wrong. Unfortunately, I've started to hear that in Barbados. We are now accepting that this is the 39 murders, or how many of it was with gun violence. It said, somebody said earlier, 29 of them, or 29 were young people. I can't remember how many were gun violence. We're starting to hear people now find this same justification that I heard in the 90s, and that I heard in the 2000s, where they start to say, well, okay, it's criminal killing criminal, it's just one less criminal. That cannot be what we aspire for, Mr. President, I do not think. So my third and last, because you know, as I say, I don't talk long. The third thing I would say is then from a business point of view, I want to make sure that everyone is very, very clear on this. Within the tourism industry, these statistics are getting out there. And you may think that you can talk it around. It's only amongst these people, or it's only within the criminal element, and it's only in certain places. That's not it. When someone reads the newspaper internationally and they see the kind of crime rates they have here, they make decisions about where to spend their money. And I am seeing it in a big way within our tourism sector. The image of Barbados is being tarnished at a time when our Prime Minister has a huge footprint on the international scene and has an opportunity really to focus great things on Barbados. At the same time, when you have great focus on Barbados and everyone wanted to know what's going on here, if in fact what's on the headline in your newspaper regularly is to do with this criminal activity, we have a problem. So I finally finish on the point where I wanted to agree with my Senator, Dr. Hines, and I want to perhaps elaborate a little bit on it, is that it's one thing to have a sentence of punishment and deterrence and rehabilitate and recompense, but fundamentally, if you do not have a direct association between the crime committed and the punishment that is meted out, we have a problem. And the speed at which our justice system works, we need to get to it for both sides. It is unfair to ask a guy for 10 years to wait for his case to be heard. It's unfair to him, and it serves us not well at all to deter anyone and to change behaviors. We can't do that. So I hope that we will spend equal time trying to stop people from committing crimes, for having the right environment that they don't feel that that's the option for them to be at, to punish and deter in the right way. And what this legislation or this amendment is doing is increasing that punishment, which I agree with, but also to spend the time and effort that is necessary to bring justice fairly and swiftly. And with those few comments, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Malalou. And the speakers, Senator Kevin Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sir, I join to rise in this debate and to be clear in my support, my unequivocal support for the government in what it is seeking to do. We would have heard various contributors speak to the purpose. And to my mind, those who detract and say that it is draconian, perhaps consideration as to where it's coming from will help shine some context in relation to where we're seeking to go. Mr. President, the sections which are being considered are Section 3, Section 7, Section 29. The previous, or the existing act, as it is yet to be amended, sir, contemplates that for these sections, there's a specified penalty. Section 3, which says if you have a firearm without a license, carries a penalty. Section 7, which deals with selling of a firearm without a license, it carries a penalty. and Section 29, which speaks to the penalty for using a firearm to commit an indictable offense. Currently, sir, the penalties as stipulated under the law range from 7 to 15 years. 7 to 15 years for the first offense, sir. For indictable offense, the current range is from 10 to 20 years, sir. So persons who may seek to say that this is some form of draconian message perhaps need to look at what was there and realize that we are simply moving, or some will say we are significantly moving, sir, from a period of 7 to 15 years to a period of now 10 to 20 years. That's going to be the new penalty. So it started off, if you're selling without a license, if you're in possession of a firearm without a license, and if you use a firearm for an indictable offense, that the existing penalty is 7 years to 15 years. That penalty now moves from 10 years to 20 years, sir. For a second offense of possession of a firearm without a license, selling a firearm without a license, or using a firearm for an indictable offense, it moves from the current penalty of 15 to 25 years to a penalty of 20 to life. Now, sir, considerations have also been built in to allow a discretion with regard to the sentencing, and that is what you call the exceptional circumstances provision, sir. Considerations with regard to the age of the individual, sir. Considerations as to whether there are any priors. And of course, considerations as the fact that public safety and order was not impacted. There's also, sir, the inclusion of a fine of up to $100,000. And some will argue that it may not be as clear as to the purpose of the fine, but let's just all agree that it is a significant deterrent. So what the government comes and seeks to do is to say, we wish to increase penalties for firearm offenses. That's the major purpose of the legislation. I think that the entire country will say that it's about time. We are told, sir, that along with this mechanism, other avenues are being exposed or explored by which the government is seeking to bring crime under control, specifically firearm crime, sir. We have been told about the increase in the budget allocated to the security forces. Indeed, sir, that was something which preceded your current role, but not your former role, sir. Yeah. We have told, sir, about the increase in judges, and we have been told about the increase of prosecutors. Indeed, sir, this holistic approach, along with the avenues and encouraging the societal interventions, set out that the government has identified a definite medium to long-term mechanism to deal with the issue, we hope. And we should certainly say, sir, that this is all well and good, and we hope the government succeeds, and they have been very clear in stipulated to give it time. The question is, sir, what happens now? What happens now? We find ourselves, sir, at the quintessential crossroads. What do we say to those who live on what I would deem the frontline communities, who have to deal with upwards of 4 shootings in a month as a norm? That is their existence. What do we tell citizens who find themselves exposed to shootings in malls? We're now seeing the Sheraton trial coming on, sir, as well as recently in public transport vehicles. The shooting that was taking place in relation to a school, thank God it was after hours, sir. What do we tell persons in the communities as we find ourselves at this quintessential crossroads? We have to support the government in the efforts to wrestle this thing to the ground. At the end of the day, sir, we are all impacted. We are all impacted. It is no longer a question that you can consider yourself safe. I heard Senator Malalu speak about it, and it is a truism. There will come a time when we see this statement that is only so and so killing so and so, that will change, and the effects are detrimental to us all. Look, the simple point is this. There can't be a partisan approach to solving this problem. Bullets don't discriminate, and they don't care who you are. I never see a dem bullet yet. Never saw a BLP bullet yet. And the fact of it that we have to stop this who did what, and what is the result of what was done in the past, or who can do better now, and bring ourselves together to find a solution. The government has the support of the people in Barbados. I told you already, well, you may not have been here for this, Mr. President. I speak for the silent, judgmental majority, sir. And we need to mobilize as a collective in this country to stop the scourge of gun violence. We did it for COVID, sir. They had Operation Seek and Save, correct? Resources were brought out. The political will was there. So let's do this for gun crime. Barbados is too small. We are literally in this situation together, sir. Right now, we're the darling of the international community, thanks to the efforts of our Prime Minister. So let's leverage these relationships. Let's build on the technical support that we have. We have CARICOM impacts, we have RSS, we have Interpol, we have the US, we have the UK, we have even China. Let's beat this thing back and find the political and community will to get it done. I support this legislation, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Boyce. Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise also to support this amendment, and I'm speaking because I believe it would be expected of me to say something on it, given my position. I think it is timely, given what has been happening in our society. And at the outset, I wish to commend the government and the Barbados Police Service for the work they've done. In the most recent bust we've had in our country, 37 guns and over 700 rounds of ammunition. If those things had gotten on the streets in the hands of people who tend to do lawless things, the results could be detrimental to us all, as most of the senators have mentioned here. But in reflecting upon this particular bill, I was thinking of the words of Cicero, the great Roman senator and statesman, who once said, "We are slaves of the law in order to be free." But he also said, "Laws are dumb in the midst of arms." Laws are dumb in the midst of arms. I've said that to say that as brilliant as this amendment may be, as brilliant as the legislation that we pass in this house, this chamber may be, there needs to be something more. And it is not something that can be brought about by legislation, but it has to be brought about by a desire for change and transformation in the minds of our people. Coincidentally, today, sir, in the church, we are observing the feast of St. Margaret, of Queen of Scotland. I believe my friend Senator Boyce will be celebrating this feast day at some point in time. And she reigned in the 11th century, and I'm just highlighting her because of what she did in her time and what she was passionate about, and I believe it speaks to some of the things that we must pay attention to here. Margaret, during her reign, was a deeply devout Christian and very spiritual person. And one of the revolutionary things she sought to bring about in the church of her time was to ensure that no one is denied, that all people are valued as human beings. No matter what the clergy thought, about their lives or how worthless they may have appeared to have been, she believed that the sacrament should have been available to all people. She was also passionate about the social construct of her realm. And so she was instrumental in building schools and orphanages and hospitals just to care for her people. But one of the things about Margaret is that she was a mother of 8. And yes, she would have had her servants and so on, but she took charge of her household to make sure that her children were instructed in the Christian faith. She personally did that. And I want to point out these things because I believe that the problem that we're facing in our society is a problem of leadership at several levels. And I'll begin at the most basic of levels, which is the family, the home. The violence that we're currently experiencing in our society, all of those people who have carried out those acts belong to families somewhere in our society. There were the children who were crying on the first day of school as they were taken to school, as little boys and little girls, snotty-nosed and teary-eyed because they were scared. And somewhere in their development, someone took their eye off them. The same thing is true for us in the church. All of those people who are committing those acts, because it's a Bajan tradition, you either have the child baptized or offered up in the church somewhere. Most of them, the majority of them, I'll say over 90% of them, were either baptized in our churches or they were received in the church somewhere. And once that happens, the church has an obligation to take care of these children because they're now a part of their body. I dare say that there we have dropped the ball as well. And then at the level of civic leadership, I was reflecting upon the work of Isaiah of Jerusalem in his first chapter, when he said, the ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's crib, but my people do not know. My people do not understand. Our princes are thieves. Our prophets prophesy for hire. And there's bloodshed in the streets of Jerusalem. But his way to quell that was not with force. His way to quell that was telling people, come, let us reason together. Let us talk it through. And I think that that is the sentiment around this chamber today, that we have a problem that we need to sit down and work out. It is not a political problem. We could call for the resignations of attorney generals in every administration we want to, but that will not solve our problem. Our problem begins at a basic level. It begins at the basic level that Senator Parrish spoke about when she encouraged people to get your children back into something wholesome. Ground them somewhere spiritually, because that is what is lacking. If we can do that, the humanity that Dr. Monroe Knight spoke about will come to the fore, because then you'll begin to value other people as equal in the eyes of their Creator, as equal in the eyes of God. Just to salve those who would not recognize him as Creator. If we cannot do that, sir, the situation will get worse. And it is not a matter, as Senator Hines was said, of saying things to placate the masses. Because one of the problems we have in Barbados right now, I believe, the previous administration was accused of being too silent. But just 2 nights ago, I was listening to some music, as I do from time to time, and Simon and Garfunkel's Sound of Silence came up. And that's some very interesting words, and just let me quote some. It said, people talking without speaking. People hearing without listening. People writing songs that voices never shared, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. There seems to be a sound of silence in this community. There's a lot of chatter. But when we hear a former commissioner saying, we're not hearing enough. We're not hearing enough. There's too much silence in this community. When we hear a leader of the private sector saying, we're not hearing enough, but people are talking, but without speaking. There's a sound of silence. And I dare say, Simon Garfunkel warned, fools, said I, you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. And if we cannot confront this thing as the people of Barbados, if everything has to be political, if everything has to be protecting my turf politically, in a few months' time, not a few months, a few weeks' time, I won't be here, unfortunately. Not that I would have gone. Richie Spice is coming to Barbados. And listening to my music a few nights ago, sir, I came across a song by Richie Spice, Earth a Run Red. Be careful the way you walk and where you talk. Watch out for the vampire them that sneak up in the dark. Watch out for the big-time thief who thinks that him smart. Bring in the crack and the guns to mash up the youth them heart. Earth a run red. And I cannot help but think that that is what is happening to us. I cannot help but think that that is what is happening in this country. And so these punitive portions of the legislation that have been added here, I commend the government. But because of the sound of silence, because of the appearance that everything is not as clear as you think it is, because people are talking without speaking, there will seemingly be, and there is seemingly, a level of cynicism in this society where no one really trusts any information. That's the reality. And the boys on the block, we educate them. I've said it before. If you want to keep your people under subjection, do not educate them. You cannot educate the people and treat them as fools. So it's only the other day, I was passing some guys and I heard a limerick. I hadn't done limericks since school, sir. I had forgotten what they were. I asked the man, what was it? He said, this is a limerick. It's a limerick about what? And he began to quote it to me. It said, rather educated. I don't know what it was about, but it was a limerick. He was saying about the state of this society. And it went something like this, if I can recall it well. I run the risk of not getting it right. Some men from BIM, they were 3, set sail on the high blue sea. They came back with some stash, worth loads of cash. Now 1 is in jail and 2 are free. I don't know what it's about. Do you know, sir? No? No, I don't know what that's about. But I'm just saying that these are the things that are on the ground out there. And there's a sound of silence. But as Simon and Garfunkel said, silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words, and I can teach you. Take my hand, and it might reach you. But my words like silent raindrops fell and echoed in the wells of silence. Will words fall into the wells of silence in this country, and we do not understand what is taking place on our streets? Those young boys and young girls are our children. And you know, before, when a little boy got into trouble, the poor mom or grandmom would be down by the court crying. He was a good boy. He never do nobody nothing. Well, it's changed a bit now. He's a good boy. He'll be here all the time, and you'll see him. He's quiet. He don't get into nothing, but he had his ways. And once here, he had his ways, you know. But that is the reality. But it requires an all-inclusive approach. The church, the religious institutions, the families, and at the level of leadership at the highest level must be involved in wrestling this beast. This legislation is good, but this is not it. Laws are dumb in the midst of arms. Once people have arms in their guns in their hands, they feel empowered. And you can set all the legislation you want. If I feel I need to take out a man, I'll take him out. That is the general thing on the ground. And we have to get serious about finding those shadows who are putting these guns in our children's hands. Because these little boys don't really import no barrels, and I don't even think that they have the money to pay for a barrel. But somebody bringing these things and putting them into their hands and learn from the rest of the region. I said it before in this chamber. I was very worried. One of my first speeches in here dealt with the fact that I was worried that our campaigns, our election campaigns, are not about issues anymore. It's about who has the power of spend. And once our campaigns become about who has the power of spend, there will come a time when you will not have enough to buy votes and you'll have to start eliminating them. Don't think it cannot happen to us, just like what you heard. Just like what you heard from Senator Malaloux and from Senator Boyce. In other countries, it was, don't worry about them, that's only down in that place. Or Senator Monroe Knight said earlier today. Silence like a cancer grows. It will grow if we do not deal with this matter. And so we have to find these people who are bringing these guns. And if they're untouchables in this society, if there are some people who are too big in this society that we cannot touch them, then perhaps we need to look at leadership and justice in this society. No one in this society should be untouchable. Because at the end of the day, the only people we'll see dying are the little small fries down on the street. I mentioned some time before, in Jamaica, there's something called a wet. Have you ever heard of it, sir? A wet is a spliff that has been soaked in embalming fluid. And this is what the kingpins are giving to little boys. Because when you smoke that, it knocks everything out of your brain. You go and commit the crime and you cannot remember anything. You cannot tell anybody anything that happened. We don't want to see that happening here. It's called what? Molly's. Here already. And for those who are au fait with what is taking place on the ground, who keep their ears close to the ground, I understand that there are some syndicates on this island that recruit young schoolboys, put them on the payroll, put a gun in their hand. I'll pay you on a monthly basis, but when I say shoot, you shoot. And all of this is taking place at a community level. And somebody knows what is happening somewhere. These boys go home, they eat. They live in a house with a mother, grandmother, aunts, everybody. But if people are seen to be benefiting from what is taking place, we have a problem. And so I'm calling on us all, Mr. President. Not anyone any more than myself, because I am culpable as well. Even if not, just not by taking care of the children that parents brought to me. Not checking up on them. Not making sure that they were being guided spiritually. And all of this is happening at a time, and I must say this, and I may be castigated for it. We're afraid that religion is becoming weaponized in Barbados. Particularly amongst us Christians. A faith that is supposed to embrace and uplift. A faith that is supposed to tell people, no matter where you are in life, you can be brought back. A faith that says you are a child of God, just as Mary of Scots would have done for her people. When the clergy were seeking to discriminate and tell people they cannot come for communion, Mary said no. And it seems as though there's a certain section of Christianity in Barbados that is only caught up with condemning. I'll take my licks, I got mine before. But this is not what we need at this time. We need to pull ourselves together as a community and see how we can embrace these people, how we can transform our society, how we can get families to recognize the obligation that is laid upon them, because if you are not guiding your children, if you're not seeking to train them, if you're not taking care of them, they'll become menaces to the society. And that is what we're seeing. And so, sir, I support this. But I hope that the only people who go to prison for this are not just the little chickens down at the bottom. If we're going to implement legislation like this, we need to see some big boys. We need to find some shadows who are bringing the guns into this country. Or all we'll be doing is just dealing with it at the lower level while the bandit factory continues to produce. And so, sir, I commend the government for bringing this legislation, but I also implore the leaders within our society, both civil and spiritual, to recognize that this is a fight that has to be undertaken by all. And this legislation alone will not win the fight, for laws are dumb in the midst of arms. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers. Senator Robert Solo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank you for the opportunity to address this chamber. As I prepared for my speech today, I, similar to Dr. Hines, took the opportunity to look for research. As a former teacher of mine, I hope she feels empowered to the fact that I attempted to look at some research before I got together with this speech. And similarly, as I discovered in university, most of the time you can find research that goes both ways. It goes for and it goes against. I listened as she spoke about the research with regard to, crime and deterrence. Similarly, I found some research by Daniel Kessler and Stephen Levitt speaking about using enhancements to distinguish between deterrence and incapacitation. And they spoke about the factor of the research they were looking at was about a sentence lengthening process that was about willful homicide, forcible rape, aggressive assault with a firearm, and the sentences surrounding those particular crimes were lengthened. And as they looked at the research, within 3 years, those crimes covered by that extension of law reduced by 8%. 7 years after the laws changed, the crimes, according to their research, went down by 20%. So as I indicated, there is research both ways. I can only hope that this amendment serves as a sufficient deterrence and that that research holds true. It is my prayer. But after I looked at the research and realized that they went both ways, I pulled back to where I tend to go to. I tend to look at who we are as Barbadians, because I am not a doctor, lawyer, a priest, a businessman, or any of those things. I do consider myself the average Barbadian. And hence, I wanted to speak to other Barbadians about crime in this country. How do we talk to it? How do we treat about it? And I found in every conversation, it boils down to responsibility. We always talk about who is responsible for how the situation has come to where it is. There were those you would engage with, and the responsibility in their opinion rests solidly with the AG. And as you heard them talk, you somehow felt that he must find himself a vat of radioactive acid and emerge a crime-fighting superhero to match his distinctive winning smile, forgetting that his remit is really, in most cases, limited to policy and legislation. Some, during the course of our conversation, spoke about the police, who have a responsibility for catching criminals, to be sure, but who are limited in number, who are not all-knowing, nor are they all-seeing. And we all know many a thing in this country goes unheard and unseen in the dark corners. Some, of course, would blame the parents, because by God and law, they have the responsibility for these seeds, the responsibility to guide, to correct, forgetting that in most cases, children don't spend most of their waking hours at home with their parents past a certain age. Others will blame the schools, some the churches. But I thought I had come up with a radical answer. Prior to stepping into this chamber today, I thought I was going to skin everyone up today. Because for me, I place the blame on us all. We're all responsible. We all hold some level of responsibility when it comes to crime and crime prevention. One of my most favorite series is called Babylon 5. I am a sci-fi person thanks to my husband. And there's a quote in there that I've always found so profound. It goes, "Big concerns grow from small concerns. You plant them, water them with tears, fertilize them with unconcern. And if you ignore them, they grow." We have become a society that ignores problems when they're small. We ignore the factors that lead small, troubled children, some of them, into becoming large, violent adults. No person, unless they've had a psychotic break, gets up one day and suddenly decides, I'm going to commit violent offenses. They don't suddenly decide, I'm going to be a drug kingpin. I mean, this isn't Breaking Bad. We can't suddenly decide we're going to have a meth lab in our garage. So the truth is faced, and must be faced, that criminals are cultivated. My goodly center knows a lot about cultivation. You know that there are lots of factors that go into it. Each small action left unchecked, each bad influence left to fester, each talent or skill ignored cultivates that small troubled child into that large violent adult. Now, I believe in a healthy dose of reality. It's one of the reasons, Mr. President, I like my stories. Today, I want to tell you one that is true. And I will not call the person's name. I won't even say the parish. But it's a cautionary tale that I see repeated quite often in this country. I know a mother who has spent the last month of her life bawling, crying her eyes out, calling every single family friend or family member possible. And she has spent that time going over her son's life in her head. To be clear, her son is not dead. Let me say that. Allay any fears up front. He's very much alive the last time I checked. He, however, now finds himself in jail on a number of firearm offenses. Not one or two, a number of firearm offenses. And as she cries, she starts to tell stories about his life. And at the end of each story, I can't help but thinking to myself, everyone sucks in this situation. At each and every story. She talks about when he was small and she and the father couldn't agree and they broke up. And he wanted to take the child because he was better able to raise him. And listening to her mother and her grandmother, she said, no, that is going to look bad on my family. I'm going to keep him. So she moved him into an overcrowded house where everyone lived, her brothers, her sisters, their children, and kept him away from his father. In that situation, to me, everyone sucked because nobody cared about his well-being. It was about what everybody else saw and thought. She talks about when he was 5 and started to run errands for her brother. You see, her brother is a criminal living in the same household. Everyone knew he sold drugs. Everyone knew he had a firearm in the house. And we know how Bajan women love their sons. So the grandmother and the great-grandmother were absolutely assured no one was going to remove that man. That was their boy. She didn't stop him from sending the boy herefore and therefore to do things for him. So even though everyone knew he was a bad influence, knew he was grooming this child with no shame, no one did anything. Forgive me, but everyone sucks. While he was in school and disrupting the class, not doing the work, the teachers approached her, explained to her the problem that was happening. But in her head, all she knew was, this is my son and you're persecuting him. So she told off the teacher. And the teacher decided, well, I'm not giving no more effort to this child. So he took a permanent seat by the door. Again, everyone sucked. And so there was no one correcting his behavior, no one attempting to help him. And when he left secondary school with no job, still living in her house, she had now moved into a place of her own. She noticed all the little issues. She noticed the heavy gold chains, pockets always full of money. No job, pockets always full of money. And in the back of her mind, she knew what was happening, but the bills were getting paid. Her son was with her. Even when she came across the gun in the house, shut her eyes, put it back, walked away. So when the shots would ring out across the pasture, and she would look out to find him barreling towards the house, sliding in and shutting the front door. In her mind, all she could think of is, there is some mother somewhere probably crying over her child's body. But her child was here, so she put that away and moved on. In all of her stories, all I could think is the fact that no man is an island. We do not exist by ourselves. We are influenced by those we meet along the journey called life, in small ways and in large ones. At various times, during a person's life, they're inflection points. They're points at which if you meet me on the road and you steer me left or right, you can make a huge difference in my life and the life of those who I interact with. We can each influence people positively, but we've stopped doing that. We have forced ourselves to come to the point of not caring, of non-interaction. We walk around society in a mode of non-contact. You know, when you have a family member that is very toxic, you know, people tend to encourage you to go no contact or low contact with them. Don't engage, walk away. We've done that with each other in society. So when we pass and we see the neighborhood children knocking out the mirrors that they're used to turn the corners, we stop and we say them in foolishness, but we don't engage. We walk away. We go to family functions and we know the criminals among us. You know which cousin sells drugs. You know which person in the community does X or Y, but you don't steer those young children away from them. You embrace them. You allow them to continue living with you in some cases. We don't report. We don't demand that those kinds of evil things be removed from our house. We don't counsel. We don't chastise. We don't even raise our voices anymore. We have become a people held in the prison of silence by our love for these people who are family members. But we've forgotten about our responsibilities to society, to community, goodness, even to other family members. Every gun floating around this country is another opportunity for another member of your family to be laying dead in the street. We don't think about it that way. We love to say, similar to what was said earlier, if you're not involved in a crime, you can't get shot in Barbados. And similar to the goodly senator, as I thought about it, I said to myself, well, I didn't know stray bullets knew accents. I didn't know that they knew about political parties. I didn't know they knew about gangs or last names, that they knew that Ernesta's gallery was the area not to go, and who was Wilfred's grandchildren out in the streets. Bullets don't care. They aren't caught up. We all bear the responsibility. So don't sit in your veranda knowing that your son who lives in the shed behind the house is a drug dealer, is bringing damage and harm and possible danger to your home where your other grandchildren sleep. And think that that is acceptable for you. Do not let your love create a monster that society has to put down. Because the reality is there are many mothers and fathers, and we all see the stories, and we all hear the famous taglines, he was a good boy. I agree with you, Senator Rogers. He was a good boy. Never do nobody nothing. But when you walk out into that community, you hear about the vagabond that he was. The demon that the neighborhood knew since he was 9 that he was going to be a problem. But you can't blame a mother caught in the throes of grief for what her mind creates, because that is her child. I would ask instead that we take off our rose-tinted glasses when these problems are small. That we have an honest reevaluation of ourselves and we look to fix the deviancy while the concerns remain small. Because when they're too late, when there are no large violent criminals, it is only the police and, similarly like today, legislation that will deal with them. So for me, when I see the AG and this particular piece of legislation come to us, I think of him as saying over the old adage, hard ears you want to hear, or where you're gonna have to feel. If you have decided that society can no longer be safe, if the safety of those around you no longer matters to you, then you should feel the weight of each firearm, the same way you feel it hanging on your hip. Feel it on your sentence. Understand the weight of each and every one, because this legislation now says you have to feel them consecutively. which means if you get charged for 3 years, 5 years, and 2 years, 10 years you will serve. Because the same way society must feel the weight of you, you have to feel the weight of your actions. We have come to the point when children go through issues in school, we beg for them. We say, Kadir, don't do it to them. But we have to learn the consequences of our action. If we spent more time teaching consequences in primary school, we would have less to deal with as adults. So I hope that this encourages those who engage for gun for hire tactics to understand that each year of your life has to have a meaning for you. And if it doesn't, if a few $1,000s means more to you than an extra year of your life walking the street, then the state will take so. Not gladly, but they will take them. For me, I see this as part of the short-term strategies, because to address this issue, similar to what everyone has said, there must be short, medium, and long-term strategies employed. And hence, this amendment recognizes that the judge needs to have and be able to assess all facets of the case when he makes a decision. There are guidelines here, yes. There are pronouncements that if this is your second offense and subsequent offense, things have got to be felt a little more hard. You have to feel the weight of that harder. And yes, a judge can take extenuating circumstances into account. It's laid out right there in the amendment. But it means that you're going to have to fight a little bit harder after that first offense to convince a judge that any extenuating circumstances could possibly be relevant. So when you've taken that first bite, know that the second one will hurt you deep. For me, one of the strategies I want us to utilize beyond this piece of legislation is to provide more safe spaces for the reporting of crimes. See, I spent earlier in this presentation talking about encouraging persons to report, but they have to have safe spaces to be able to do that reporting. Because it is hard to ask Ernesta to report on the activity that she sees Miss Millicent's son doing when she has to sit next to Miss Millicent in church on Sunday. This is her community. So when she reports on this person, she feels the weight if that community suddenly knows that she has done this. They need to be able to trust that the police will do what they need to do, but I have done what I should do as a citizen. Anonymous, safe reporting spaces. I also want more training for the police. And yes, more training in terms of better firearms use is great. De-arming and de-escalation tactics, yes. But I want them trained in soft skills. Let me say that again. Soft skills. I want them trained in emotional intelligence. I want when someone comes to make a report, whether it's for rape or any other crime, they're able to respond with compassion and understanding. Too many times you hear about people making reports to police, and it is either laughter or a face that tells you, move from in front of me because I am not interested in your small chat. And that is not to say that that is every policeman. In no ways I'm impugning that. I'm saying we know that this situation exists. Let us train them to do better and to be better. Because one of the hardest things to do is to report on someone you love. And care and understanding has to be the order of the day when you are faced with those situations as a policeman. Conversely, I also want Barbadians to have better access to the information regarding the Police Complaints Authority. Because let us not be fooled. It is not as though the police are always blameless. It is not as though in this society there are not always some bad apples that need to be reported on. If you want people to trust, then we have to give them a place which they can feel that they can report on something they feel is in error. So I want some more information, promotion of information. Where is the organization located? How do you make a complaint? Who makes up the authority? How investigations and decisions are made? That is important towards rebuilding relationships, rebuilding community trust between the police and the community. I also want to tag on a call for more youth groups, more youth activities. It's one of the things I've heard the Prime Minister speak about. Because yes, they keep children busy, they keep them active, they teach them skills, but they also show them the possibility of a different life. They show them things that they don't always see. I am always quick to say up front, I am a poor girl from Fords Road. I've also lived in Britton's Hill, Carrington Village, all over this country. It happens when you have a single mother who rents. You go wherever it is possible. I know what it is to be surrounded by poverty. And sometimes it makes your vision small. Because all I'm seeing is what's happening next door to me, around the corner from me. I'm not seeing the possibilities of what I could be, what I could do. I'm fortunate to have attended Luther Thorne, where there were many different opportunities to see many different aspects of life. I had the opportunity to be involved in Holders Hill Opera, in NIFCA, and many other things. So it allows me to see the way people live in a different light, to talk to those people, to understand the level of effort you had to put in to get where you wanted to be. And therefore, very early I was able to understand that there's quick money and there's long money. Which one you want to choose? And I feel that children are not getting as much opportunity to be able to be exposed to other ways of life. You cannot ask me to reach for the stars when I don't even see past the cloud line. So we need to do more of that, more extracurricular activities, more opportunities for children to reach out, to stretch out. Because if you don't give me heroes, then you gave me bad boys. And eventually, they stop being bad to me. They start being my heroes. So then you cannot argue with me when I tell you that that is where I want to go. For those of you who are in civil society groups, church organizations, any committee or organization out there, I am asking you to take a weekend, 2 to 3 hours a month if you need to. Reach out to a school, reach out to a group, spend some time with some kids. Even if all you're doing is standing and telling them the story of your life, telling them how you got from A to B, giving them something to latch on to about the possibilities for them, because hope is a serious thing. One would say once upon a time, hope won a man an election. Twice. If you don't give me hope, then whatever is left, I will hold on to. And nothing else you tell me will change that for me. As for medium and long-term strategies, reform of our education system is necessary. There is nothing I can say beyond that. It's a long, arduous task that the Ministry of Education is entrenched in, because it cannot be about a change of whims and fancies, but one aimed at dragging us forward out of our wants but into our needs for the betterment of our children. The reform of the social services I've spoken to in my first speech in this place, and I am eager to see it happen. We need to provide help for parents, and in some cases, we need to look at court-mandated help, because I know that the Child Care Board and other organizations put on parenting classes. I also know that they're free. I also know that the attendance is low. And the head individuals who are in need of the assistance will not take it. So if need be, we may need to look at mandated in situations where we see it is a desperate need. I also want us to look at reform of our prison services. Because yes, while I fully support this legislation, these people are also still part of us. And the work that needs to happen to rehabilitate them is necessary. We know that the environment and societal pressures put people on roads and paths. My good fellow Senator King will tell you that sometimes when you have reformed an individual and you've given them tools, but you send them back into the same community, it is as though you have done nothing at all. As if a big eraser has rubbed all across all that work you've spent a year and a half doing. Because society and everyday pressures are key. As I indicated, one of the strategies, but I see it as short, medium, long, forever, it is important and it must always happen, is that of jobs, work. There are those who are engaged in crime as though it is their lifelong love affair. It is their profession. But there are those who are engaged because they don't have another choice, because for them, survival is key. And I know that the Prime Minister has put a lot of initiatives into place, from the ash cleanup, which turned into a debushing program all through this country, to those involved in the digitization centers, to those who assisted us through COVID in various positions, to those who now find work on cruise ships, to those who are eagerly awaiting the gaming opportunities to be brought about by the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Smart Technology, and the future pharmaceutical jobs to which the Prime Minister spoke to yesterday. This government cannot concern itself necessarily with those who believe that the most knowledge of the road comes from sitting in the back seat. It must concern itself with those who live in Barbados every day, who have needs, wants, which must be taken care of. And therefore, we must press on, press forward. And for those who some may consider to have an overinflated sense of self, who sometimes call work low-skilled, I warn them, severely warn them, that while they may never have known life beyond a suit and collar job, all work is honorable. All work is worth dignity and respect in this country. So respect any man and woman who gets up every day and goes to work, whether you consider that job to be worthy or not. At its core, Mr. President, I categorize this amendment in two sections. One, that deals with responsibility and consequences, and the other that looks at improvements to the system, or more accurately, making the system make sense. For example, the amendment which functionally allows a jury of 12 to deal with a firearms charge, I agree, makes sense. Previously, you would have charged them with the murder, perhaps left the firearm charge on the side because you were going for the bigger offense. But what happens when you don't get through on the murder charge? That person is gone scot-free because it would have required you to have two trials, one with 12 and then one with 9. I know a good economics person will tell you that that was a smart bet. So I'm very glad to see that we have changed it. So at the same time we are going through one, we will go through the other, and all two will serve as they should. So I'm happy to see that change. The other changes with regard to the sporting license and the hunting license, again, I am very happy to see. In whole, there is no doubt that the country has a whole of country problem, which is crime, and needs a whole of country approach. The police have their jobs to do. The framework is there. The judges have their jobs to do. The Sentencing Act now has teeth, and they must play their part. But we as a society must play our part. We must stand up for the collective safety and sanctity of this village we call home. This is not a banana republic. The government and the people who sit in the other house and here, the other place, sorry, and here, can only put legislation in place. But we must all work at making the situation itself better. And with that, Mr. President, I am obliged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Roberts Odom. Any other speakers? Senator Anveli Boyce.
We committed at this stage.
Sorry?
We committed at this stage before Senator Boyce speaks.
Sure. Clear.
Recommittal of presentation of papers.
Senator Dr. Roberts Odom. Sorry. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, I'm commanded to lay the following documents. Conservation Funding Agreement dated as of September 20th, 2022, among the Government of Barbados, the Nature Conservancy, Barbados Environmental Sustainable Fund, Inc., and Barbados Blue Conservation Trust, and Conservation and Sustainability Commitments Agreement dated as of September 20th, 2022, between the Government of Barbados and the Nature Conservancy.
Recommittal, sir, of motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate, moved by Minister.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the resolution that Parliament accept the Barbados National,
We're on to motions related to business of Parliament.
This election of John Rogers. Mr. President, I beg that we elect Senator Dr. John Rogers to be the Deputy President of this sitting.
Sorry. The question is that Reverend Dr. John Roberts act as Deputy President of the Senate for the remainder of the sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. Senator Dr. Rogers, please take your place. And thank you for agreeing to serve.
Mr. President, we go to recommittal of introduction of bills. We will have notice of that resolution.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, I give notice of the resolution that Parliament accepts the Barbados National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan 2020 as the guiding national policy document for the management and conservation of biodiversity 2022. It's in here, it's 2020. Sorry. Of biodiversity in Barbados and the associated reports.
Revert to public business, sir.
Public business resumes. Senator Anveli Boyce.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. Before I begin, I want to thank all of my colleagues for the sobriety and the various calls to conscience that we heard in the chamber throughout the day's debate. Mr. President, I enter this debate this evening as the youngest member of the chamber and someone who has enjoyed the peace and stability of this nation and someone who recognizes that peace and stability is part of the project and promise of this country and someone who wishes for it to remain so for some time to come. As a young person, I want to live, work, party, do business here, and when I become an older person, retire without frequent episodes of violence and certainly without increasing gun crime. I say all of this, Mr. President, in part because I have nowhere to go. Unlike many of my older colleagues, I don't even have a Barbados of old to recall. Barbados, this Barbados, is what I and my generation and those younger than us have. And we're at the risk of losing it if we fail to get it right. Each time we hear a story, a breaking news story, or hear a headline, or see a headline of a shooting in this country, every time we hear a mother recite the virtues of her son, regardless of his role in the latest episode of violence, whether perpetrator or victim, we as a collective and as a country lose. It is that threat of continued loss that has led us here today, Mr. President, and has led the government to act on what is one of the most pressing issues in the country. As the UN Office on Drugs and Crime tells us, the problems associated with criminality and firearms are of such a complex nature that curtailing them requires tailored interventions involving corresponding criminal justice responses, prevention, investigation, and prosecution of crimes. Sir, in the main, it is the criminal justice response that has brought us here today. The amendments before the House are aimed, as we have heard, at creating a sentence that would deter the commission of firearm offenses. There are a number of objectives to sentencing, as we have also heard, as imposed by the courts. And one of them is deterrence. And to go further, there are two aspects of deterrence: deterrence of the offender and of the likely offender. In each case, Mr. President, the government is indicating that the commission of these crimes is abhorrent and intolerable, and we can no longer tolerate a compromise to the peace and promise of this country, Barbados. And that in the opinion of the government, the time has come for those who engage in the type of violence to take notice, Mr. President, that we are seeking to increase the penalties available to the court in relation to sentencing. Make no mistake, Mr. President, there is no delight in this exercise. We do not come here this evening happily. At least I don't, and I don't believe that any of my colleagues on either side of the chamber do either. I do not believe that the government rejoices when it proposes that an individual who is found guilty of a firearm offense under the Act for the first time may be sentenced to no less than 10 years and no more than 20 years. As members of this place, as Barbadians, we all wish things could go differently. But there's a responsibility to keep Barbados safe, and that is a responsibility that this government will not shirk. Similarly, where the law provides for a judge to sentence a person who is found guilty of a second or subsequent firearm offense to a minimum of 20 years in jail or up to life imprisonment, or where the amendment also makes provision for an individual guilty of more than one firearm offense from the same event or a series of events to serve consecutive prison terms rather than concurrent sentences. There is no rejoicing, Mr. President, perhaps only comfort in the possibility of this country maintaining relative peace and good order. These amendments represent stiffer penalties for those who breach the law, because we must deter those who have convinced themselves that breaching the law, that terrorizing neighborhoods, that making mourners of mothers is the only way. We cannot cede this country to the criminal element. Sir, while we are treating to this issue today legislatively, and more specifically with amendments to the relevant acts, I am encouraged by the commitment of the government to take a comprehensive and multi-pronged approach to this effort. In this preventative effort, the government has done important work in keeping us safe, and I think that work ought to be commended, although it is work that must continue. It was this government that installed scanners at the Bridgetown port, as we have heard. It is this government that regularly engages in courses to increase the capacity of our security officials to keep firearms, which we are concerned about, out of the country. While the government is the government's role is an important part of the strategy to fight the scourge of firearms on the island, there is room for collective action. If the interventions, if the fight, pardon the pun, to combat crime is to be successful, it will require deliberate positive action from all of us. We have heard the Prime Minister and the Minister of State in the Attorney General's office make a call for Barbadians of goodwill to contribute. We need you, your country needs you, my generation needs you. For too long, Mr. President, we have only concerned ourselves with deviance and violence in this country if it impacts us or the people that we love. But if we don't all take a personal stake in creating a safer Barbados, our walls will never be high enough, our island will never be large enough, our events will never be secure enough to keep us safe. When we each take a stand and become invested in this Barbadian project, a few things will happen. Our education system will prevent children from falling through its cracks. Schools will not make delinquents of our children for pant sizes and hairstyles and shoe colors, and we will not be so easily inclined to deny access to education, even and especially when our children show evidence of wayward behavior. And we will instead consider the extent to which these approaches indicate to our children that they're bad and make them accustomed to the absence of structure and instruction that they so desperately need. Parents will take an active role in the lives of their children, keeping a watchful eye, paying attention to changes in behavior, and being proactive in the identification of issues, particularly those where they will require support. Churches will be more pastoral than preachy, and will do more than wring their hands about the generation of young people who do not find home within their pews. Police will develop a relationship with the communities they serve, a relationship, Mr. President, built on more on trust than on authority. I do not wish to suggest that this work will be easy, but we have often thought in this country of ourselves as capable of doing difficult things, whether that is creating that which has never existed before, or in this case, beating back troubling trends. And with this collective approach, we can succeed in the effort of maintaining Barbados's promise, Mr. President. The idea of taking a public health approach, which one of my colleague senators spoke about this morning, is permeating the literature, if you will, and has become popular in this effort to keep countries safe. This kind of approach assesses the impact of guns on the entire population with a view to intimately understanding the issue, including the scope, characteristics, and causes of the problem. Second, it requires a shift towards primary prevention, which focuses on preventing problems before they have occurred. Mr. President, the appointment of the Minister of State in the Attorney General's office with responsibility for crime prevention is critical to that effort, specifically crafting those efforts aimed at rooting out antisocial behavior. Long before any gun is procured or fired, long before any life is threatened or lost. Because as we say in this country, prevention is better than cure. It must be noted, Mr. President, that there is a regime of government policy and programs so that we are not starting from ground zero. You have heard each of my colleague senators speak about the Ministry of Education's commitment to education reform. In training, there's a construction gateway initiative. In the social services arena, there's a commitment to reform and to modernize the provision of social services and the development of a family services department. And I want to take a minute there, Mr. President, because I think often when we think about the provision of social services, we think about benefits, monetary benefits alone. And I am pleased every time I hear the substantive minister speak about this reform, because he finds a way to privilege mental health and psychosocial issues in the effort. And I am eagerly looking forward to that program and policy being rolled out, Mr. President. I think there is progress to be made there. There's progress to be made in relation to our fight against violence in that regard. In all of this, Mr. President, we must be led by the data. I say in here all the time and in many other places that we are not sufficiently led by the data. And it is a public health approach will privilege data in the way that is necessary, looking at the possible risk factors that might increase or decrease the incidence of gun crime and gun problems, working across ministries, departments, and agencies, mobilizing resources and developing programs with a view to cauterizing the risks. Permit me, Mr. President, to offer a caution as the government engages in the process of developing programs and policies, though. And it is this: any preventative measure beyond the law used as part of the overall project to keep this country safe cannot be heavy-handed. Although, if we are honest with ourselves, that is where our cultural impulses may lead us. We should be careful not to make deviants of our adolescents and young adults, make sure that the programs that we develop offer structure and guidance and increased opportunities and new experiences, but also make sure that kindness and care undergird it all. Each time we come here, Mr. President, we hope that which we do here will make a difference and have a positive impact. But the results of a program undergirded by kindness and care can hopefully stave off the use of the very amendments we consider today. We can only hope. Sir, there are no easy answers. There is no single thing. The contours of the public discourse often suggest that there is a single thing that if the government was attuned enough, attentive enough, it would find in the seams of our society, and our problems relative to violence and gun violence in particular would be no more. There is no one thing. It is not just fatherlessness or single-parent households. It is not just the influence of dancehall music and culture. There are no easy answers, but we must ask tough questions. Does corporal punishment work? Do parents have enough support in the rearing of their children? To what extent is the aggression seen in children the absence of conflict resolution tools and techniques, and what are we prepared to do about it? Have we given young people the ability to imagine so that they see beyond the opacity of anything that currently challenges them, and more critically see that a life of crime is not the answer? Those are the questions, and many, many more. And the only way we can find answers is through proximity to the people and communities impacted most. So I encourage us all to engage, to listen, not to problematize, to be be prepared to be surprised at the sources of and solutions of this problem. It is an effort, Mr. President, it is a collective effort that must be defined by the Barbadian spirit. A spirit that looks at the difficult thing and says, we can fix it, all of us together. I support these amendments and the broader thrust of the government to keep our island safe. Barbados cannot afford for the social decay born of violence to take root. We cannot be a people anxious about our ability to make it through the day. We cannot lose too sizable a percentage of my generation to guns. We cannot compromise on the project and promise of this country. The stakes are too high, the costs are too much. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Andretti Boyce. If there are no more speakers, Senator Herod.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to join my colleagues in terms of supporting this bill today that we are focusing on in terms of firearms and the restriction of activities related to firearm crimes. Mr. President, the modern evolution of crime in Barbados is perhaps aligned to the development of technology all across the world. A world of increased globalization, enhanced cultural infusion, and of course, a world that is now entrenched with fiscal and financial constraints that we've never seen in the modern take of our history. Mr. President, speaking of the history, and even speaking to those who have been here longer than I have been here and seen far more than I have seen, I can only imagine in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, the days of Juchet Inisher and Georgie Porgy. I could only imagine that back then, any situation where honourable members were in this chamber speaking about constant gun crimes would have appeared to be an abnormality, perverting the very natural expectations of right-thinking Barbadians. It would have been out of place to be discussing that back then. There was crime back then, but nothing to the extent or the frequency, perhaps, of what we've seen over the last 2 decades, Mr. President. Even when, Mr. President, if you permit me, when we check the statistics from the World Bank, the empirical evidence tells us that when we look at the rate of crimes under the categorization of intentional homicides, it tells a story back in 1994 of a Barbados that had a statistic per 100,000 of 7.5. 1994, the latter part of 7.5. And then in 1995, under the stewardship of the late former Prime Minister Oinatha, that statistic dropped to 6.39. And it remains over the last 40 years to be the lowest statistic with respect to intentional crime under the leadership of the Barbados Labour Party and the former Prime Minister. But while the data is useful, we know that this crime and this discussion about crime is more about, it's more than just numbers, you know? It is about people. It is about their intentions. It is about their motivations. It is about the influences in society and the influencers in society as well. And it brings me to why we're here today, Mr. President, because we have to do all within our means collectively and individually, within this honourable chamber, within the community, within any other forum that we participate, to respond to the proliferation of what has been described as a vagabond culture that threatens to derail the socio-economic prosperity that we currently have, and more importantly, the ones that our children and grandchildren and the young persons of the future will have as well. Like many of my colleagues, I support the bill because tougher measures are needed now. Tougher measures are needed now. Otherwise, the days of comparative analysis where we look to the north and talk about Jamaica and Haiti, and we look to the south and talk about Trinidad and Tobago and Latin American countries, those comparative analyses will be deemed irrelevant in terms of relative stability of a country, and we don't want to get to that point. I recognize and I support the efforts of the government, and I recognize and I support the comments from the general public. And in so doing, I also agree that, well, today we speak and subsequently vote on the consequence of this issue, that equal emphasis must be placed on the pragmatic interventions that are made to arrest these situations before they occur. In summary, we must deal with the cause and the effect simultaneously. We do not have any other choice in the matter. Now, the government is very aware of the dynamics of the crime, and this is why in November last year, sir, or as of November last year, we no longer have a Royal Barbados Police Force. We have a police service. Out of the recognition, sir, that a carrot and stick approach, as is internationally known, is a more long-term and sustainable intervention for combating crime, not only in Barbados, but in many other countries. I speak of a stick because I say with pellucid clarity that there ought to be no tolerance whatsoever in terms of having persons continue to think or continue to act in a way that disregards the lives of other persons in Barbados. No tolerance. But I also say in terms of the carrot, sir, that it entails the admittance of connectivity between crime and other aspects in society. One that identifies with a doctrine of positive reinforcement. A similar example is happening right now in Jamaica, where they have the gun amnesty from the 5th of this month until this Saturday, I believe, is when the closing date is. And only last week, Thursday, Mr. President, the Acting Commissioner of Police went on television in terms of the press conference that he had, and he appealed to all in society. He appealed to the private sector, government entities. He appealed even to the church, NGOs, individuals, and households. And this appeal tells me that the police understand that the origin of this issue is multifaceted, and therefore the approach has to be multidisciplinary, drawing on the skill sets and experience of those who desire to make a change, and equally as important, drawing on the skill sets and desires of those who have the capacity to make a change as well. If we, in this honorable chamber, Mr. President, admit, as I believe, that this is a multidisciplinary situation, multidisciplinary approach that we need to have, then I say without any means of apology that it sits high up there on the agenda along the more popular terms that we use: youth mainstreaming, climate change mainstreaming, gender mainstreaming. And if I may make an aside to gender mainstreaming, let me just say that gender mainstreaming does not mean putting more women or putting more men in any specific job or any specific aspect of society. It means removing each and all barriers to consideration and participation and placing inputs in all aspects. In the natural spirit of things, you will see definitely in the short term one specific aspect being more prominent in terms of their acceptance and participation. I understand that. But gender mainstreaming means removing all barriers, not putting numbers and plugging persons for numbers for optics. It means leveling the playing field. It means, therefore, that we look at all of the possibilities of joint programming across the NGOs, across the government, and across the private sector, so that we can have an identification, a limitation, and eventually a termination of those very activities before they're allowed to aggravate society. I heard some admittance earlier on my way back to the House of culpability in terms of the forums that Senator Rogers will participate in regularly. But equally as well, Mr. President, I admit that there is some level of culpability there. I also want to recognize the efforts of the Barbados Christian Council, who most recently admitted and acknowledged to the public that they're establishing a task force to specifically look at this issue of crime in Barbados and gun crime. This singled out the young men, and understandably so, because the young men seem to be the main perpetrators of the crimes that are the topic of the day. I would only ask that the Barbados Christian Council, though, after their analysis, after their strategies, after their work plans and implementation plans to combat it, that they do it in a participatory manner alongside the social services and the established security services, because we are all in this together. And we really want them to feel a sense of embrace. And we also want the police service to know that the Barbados Christian Council and other organizations are in this fight with them as well. As it was acknowledged earlier, Mr. President, we have a new minister who has been tasked to focus on developing a strategy to combat this prevailing situation. And I have the fullest of confidence that we will see something comprehensive. And while that comprehensive document or doctrine or framework has not been completed, I have some ideas as well in terms of crime prevention mainstreaming. In a similar manner, sir, to how the Met Office can look at different parameters, relative humidity, cloud cover, all the other different things that they look up. I'm not a scientist to that extent, so pardon me if I call the words a bit skewed. But the same way how they can look at all of these parameters to make predictions as to how the weather will look next week and 2 weeks after, 2 or 3 days later, I believe we also need to develop tools so that we can conduct assessments or surveys on a regular and ongoing basis and be able to detect the incidence or the likelihood or the possibility of some of these societal infringements in terms of not only firearm crimes, but crimes on a whole. And it doesn't mean, Mr. President, that we're doing this to categorize persons as criminals or likely criminals. It means that we would be looking to identify risks and the risks of being exposed to or influenced by criminal activity in the environment as well. And of course, if we do any of those surveys, the relevant permissions will be given well in advance, even for persons that are minors. But Mr. President, I also want to speak to the issue of housing. And I want to recognize from the side of this government the upcoming housing census announced last week by Minister Sutherland. It presents for us an important data set for analyzing population density and allows the relevant authorities to superimpose some of the criminal content in terms of the data over the population density and allow them to identify correlations and relationships between the continuation of crime and also the population density. But Mr. President, while this is useful, the Ministry of Housing's role goes far beyond facilitating the mapping of crime. The Ministry of Housing plays a role that is key to advancing a sense of individual pride and value, where low self-esteem may linger, and instilling a measure of hope where hopelessness exists. Two unfortunate situations for criminal elements to exploit, and they do exploit it. They know that people naturally like space for the most part. And the best way to repel these criminal temptations is basically to advance those needs before they're exploited. And in all fairness, as a government, any person would know that any government around the world, even the richest governments, are always trying to satisfy unlimited needs with limited resources. But the grim reality is that there are persons in this country that are desperately in need of space. Let it be no denial of the fact that people value property and space. And they should value it because property and space carry significant value as an asset. In fact, if I'm allowed to pull from some statistics again, when we look at the contribution to GDP between 2018 and 2021, the years of COVID, we see, Mr. President, that accommodation and food services, two of the pillars and bedrocks of the tourism industry, would have decreased from $1.3 billion in 2018 to the end of last year, and it was $597.8 million, a significant drop. However, when we look at the bedrock of space that I'm talking about, real estate, 2018, $936.5 million. 2019, $1.08 billion. 2019, the peak of the COVID. 2020, $1.1 billion. And at the end of last year, $1.182 billion again. So while we had the peak of COVID, persons were investing heavily still in real estate. And I want to say that not necessarily to focus on GDP, but to really get back to the fact that people value space. The long and short is that we recognize the value of property and the usefulness of space at home, Mr. President, as part of a natural deterrent for our young men who, without many other options, would seek the comfort in some other open area or not so open areas that may promote or seek to promote unlawful activities. Space is important. And while I would not wish to disabuse the perception of those who think that crime permeates much easier on a block, I would not want to bring focus on the fact, or I would want to bring focus on the fact that guns are not manufactured on the block, ammunition is not manufactured on the blocks, and not all outdoor congregations of young men or young people or people on a whole are intended to commit crime. In fact, it is possible, Mr. President, for crimes to be planned and committed in the heights and terraces. In fact, it is possible for crimes to be committed and planned on yachts. Mr. President, it is also possible unknowingly or deliberately that crimes can be ignored by many persons in critical positions of governance. While I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I cannot help but ask myself, who are the persons in Barbados most likely and most with the ability to easily facilitate the procurement and distribution of firearms across this country? I leave it there as food for thought. When it comes, Mr. President, to community development, and this is at the heart of my presentation, I must say, so my gloves will be off when it comes to this particular aspect, and giving fair warning. Community development is a critical tool for bridging that generational gap of poverty, and who feels it knows it. I would say that. Mr. President, you know where I live, and I remember years ago I came to you as a man. You can call me a young man, but years ago I came to you when you were the MP for my area, and I told you, sir, I needed support for this small DJ competition that I wanted in the community. And without hesitation, the resources were provided for me to facilitate that in Sears Court. And such was the success that it became the longest running annual DJ competition in Barbados at the time, running for 6 years. Constant support, sir. And for that, I really want to thank you. But Mr. President, it has not, he deserves it, he deserves it. But Mr. President, since your departure, a lot has happened in the community and the constituency and across Barbados as well. And I don't want to say that it is because of your departure that it has happened, but it just happens to be coincidental. Despite the inevitable displeasure of those who listen to the songs and the music of that DJ competition, you know, some persons, particularly elder persons, were not in favor of the noise, and I fully understand and appreciate it. The vast majority of persons who were there from the Fair Valley and the Silver Sands area, Gibbons, Bournes Land, Crossy Road, they had a sense of community togetherness. We never had an issue, of guns and people firing off shots and all this stuff that you hear at other events, because we never had proper security, I would admit to it. But persons had a sense of commitment to the community event and a sense of purpose relative to other persons there at events as well. I remember saying to you, sir, one year as well, at one of the events on the block, that I have a vision for the community. And I recall you saying to me, sir, that is it. Very good. You can't have a plan without a vision. I know the exact location as well. One of these days, I can probably put a placard and remind persons of where he started this vision. And for those kind words again, sir, thank you. Because the intention of seeing this vision for that community and the constituency as a whole, and Barbados as a whole, is far from over. It brings me, therefore, to join with the police service in their appeal to all persons and all entities across Barbados to join the effort at winning back our communities. Our political leader has said from time to time in many different forms, one-on-one blow, let's kill the whole cow. A collective call to arms in our fight against crime and a recognition that it has to be a sustained effort. It won't happen overnight. But while I am optimistic, I am also practical. And experience permits me not to ignore another saying about another cow. Take a cow to the water, but you can't force it to drink. And with that analogy, I want to appeal, similar to the member for the city as he spoke on the radio recently, to all of those persons in positions of influence and positions of power. I want them, basically, when they're faced with persons from the communities on the front lines, that present to them ideas to take the community forward, when they present to them some risks that they identify, please embrace them. Please be receptive to them. They may not be 100% correct, but at least if you're receptive, they have a sense that, you're willing to actually take on some of the things that they're talking about. Mr. President, I appeal to them to recognize the dynamics that makes each community different. The uniqueness of Fairy Valley, of Silver Sands, of Hopewell, of Coverley, and Pilgrim Road and Parish Land is quite different from the look and feel and culture of Strathclyde or Sanquet cul-de-sac in Atlantic Shores. So when I say no, as I said last year, and the year before, and the year before then, that we need a community center in Sears Court as a matter of urgency to advance the skill set, not only of the children, but of the parents. I speak from the perspective of a person who has taken note of some of the most serious gun crimes in my area. Whether it be back in 2014, when a 39-year-old was gunned down at a football competition, whether it be back in 2016, when a 30-year-old was shot at St. Christopher and can no longer walk, whether it be back in 2017, when another 39-year-old was shot in Bornsland in the hip, or whether, sir, it be in the same year, 2017, when a 19-year-old was shot and killed on the hard court at St. Christopher in Christchurch. And the sad thing about this scenario, it hurts my heart to say it just got some cold bumps, is that I know both the perpetrator and the victim, and they live in very close proximity. So, sir, when I call, along with the many other persons, not only in Sears Court, but persons in Parish Land too, but persons all across Barbados, some in the city, based on what was said by the member for the city, all across Barbados, when they call for community centers and afternoon activities for their children and also for the parents, listen to them. Listen to them, because they are the ones on the front line, and I'm speaking as a senator in this honourable chamber, as a person who lives in one of the communities on the front line as well. I want to recognize, Mr. President, that efforts are still being made regardless of the interventions needed by the government. And I wish to recognize a gentleman who gave me permission to call his name, I only call his last name, Mr. Yard, and this is the big Fairy Valley, and he uses the Fairy Valley Pavilion on many Sundays to teach the youngsters life skills right after church. And it's these type of interventions at the community level that we need to embrace, and embrace as soon as possible. Mr. President, this is not a debate about innocence in terms of firearms. This is a debate about intervention, response, intervention, and proactive intervention. In closing, Mr. President, I want to align myself to the government and support this bill today, because I believe it is the right thing to do to strengthen our provisions, to punish or deter firearm-related crimes. I support it with the understanding that after we debate today, there will be an embrace of some of the suggestions, and more importantly, we will start to see a more targeted approach towards the causes of these consequences that we're discussing today. I also believe that if we are to see a commitment to results in this country with respect to crime, we must also see a commitment of resources. And those resources go beyond the allocation from the government or the Treasury. Each person has a resource. Each person has something to offer. Each NGO. Everyone has something to play in this role. And with those many words, Mr. President, I am obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Herbert. If they aren't. Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, I'm grateful for the opportunity to lend my voice in the debate, and I see that you have an acting deputy president next to you who has told other honourable senators on the last occasion that I once openly battled with him on a couple of occasions. So he would tell you, sir, that I am not accustomed to closing the innings because I would have been out a long time. This debate is one in which almost everyone has spoken, and really you can gather that there is a broad consensus that something has to be done, at least at the legislative level, to address what many people believe is a criminal justice system that has gone too soft on gun crime. The sentences, minimum sentences have been, mandatory minimum sentences have been struck down by our courts. And one must begin by congratulating the Law Reform Commission, those seamless officers of the law, long in the tooth, as some people would say, have been around for a long time, but who have brought to bear their experience, their knowledge of the Barbadian society, what we take as a people, and have listened to what the courts have said, not only our own appellate courts, but the Caribbean Court of Justice or Apex Court, because there are a number of decisions which would have brought the refashioning of this legislation to its present state. And I want to hail them because the bill, to my mind, meets both the legislative test and the legislative aim that Parliament must pass laws for the peace, order, and governance of society. And at the same time, we do not disproportionately encroach on the rights of people, that there must be a connection between the legislative aim and what the constitutional requirements in terms of affording people basic human rights to dignity and securing the security of persons, and all of these things that are important constitutional principles are met. I know there has been some disquiet, Mr. President, as to why is the government bringing another piece of legislation seemingly to address the surge of crime in Barbados in a year when the Bill Amendment Act was struck down by the court. And therefore the government is only doing this as a means of political window dressing, knowing that these things cannot stand the test of past muster in the court. I want to scotch that argument because it is to my mind nonsense on stilts. And I want to address it from the perspective that the legislature must do its job. The legislature cannot anticipate what a court is going to do. Laws are brought here that are scrutinized and certified by the Office of the Attorney General, who has to give it his approval before it goes to Cabinet and before it comes to Parliament. And the Attorney General can speak in broad terms as to what the overall aspect of government's legislative program will be and whether it meets all the constitutional parameters. But at the same time, the Attorney General cannot anticipate what a court will do. And I want to speak to that because the Bill Amendment Bill, which was struck down by our courts, was struck down by the courts, the High Court of Barbados. The matter is on appeal. We don't know where that will go. But I want to assuage the concern of honourable senators and those who are listening that there are some novel issues with respect to that Bill Amendment Act. And I just want to bring that concern, Mr. President, if you may permit me the latitude, because in that act, in order for it to pass both houses of Parliament, it had to have the requisite numbers because it was altering the provision of the Constitution that dealt with the freedom of the individual, taking away the right of that person charged with a gun crime to apply for bail. So that in the view of the government, the only requirement to alter the Constitution is settled in Section 49. It was passed in both houses with a 2/3 majority. Now, it was struck down not because it failed to meet any of the constitutional requirements set out in the Constitution, but only because the court held it to a standard on a basis of a principle called the separation of powers. A principle itself not written into the constitutional text, and use a standard of proportionality which constitutional lawyers have always been arguing about proportionality and the infringement of constitutional rights. But this was the first time that this was not an ordinary piece of legislation that was struck down, but a constitutional amendment that was struck down. So that the courts, the higher appellate courts have their work cut out as to whether or not there are parts of the Constitution that cannot be amended, because that would be the effect of the court's judgment at the High Court level. So that I want to assuage concerns of the public that this is a question of being addressing. This is a very, very serious bill that has come to our notice today. I believe, Mr. President, that if you do the crime, you must do the time. Gun crimes and gun violence, the sentences for those are too light in my respective submission. And I know that there has been concern raised today, Mr. President, that deterrence as an aspect of the sentencing process. There are studies that show that there's no deterrence for long sentences. But the truth is that there are other objectives of sentencing too, like retribution. And we live in too small a society to be concerned only about deterrence. We have to punish people who have the temerity to do those brazen acts of violence. Shooting a man on the beach with his child in his hand. We didn't know that kind of crime in Barbados. While gun violence has always been a problem, I will speak to it a bit later, the brazen nature of it is what is shocking the conscience of Barbadians. And we are not increasing these sentences because the government is trying to deter those individuals. We're sending a signal that it will come to an end because you will pay the price for these crimes. Now, the government is saying also that it will put the resources, and it has put its money where its mouth is. The Honourable other senators who spoke before me, Mr. President, has spoken to the work that has been done to support the police, to increase the courts, and to remove the backlog from the system. So that what Senator Dr. Hines spoke to about having a reliable, fast-moving criminal justice system will act as a deterrent more so is what the government is also working on. But we have to put this legislative change to increasing those minimum sentences. In other words, you commit this crime, there is a minimum of a sentence. And only in exceptional circumstances will a judge say, well, look, I can't even contemplate what could be, because the bill does not list out what the exceptional circumstances could be. So any factual circumstance that makes sense to the sentencing court, the judge can say, well, look, this passes muster. And that gives a broad and wide discretion that preserves the sentencing power of the courts. Now, we have, Mr. President, to recognize that there's sometimes when the laws of the land become outstripped by the capacity of the criminals and the criminal elements in our society. And we have to deal with that. This bill does that in my respectful submission, Mr. President. And without trying to call out segments of the society where you listen to ordinary people going on, ordinary Bajans tell you they know who bringing in the guns. If we listen to the people of Barbados, they'll tell you who we know who bringing in the guns. We can see the development of businesses in places in Barbados where the owners and proprietors of these businesses cannot show the income to match the large infrastructure and physical development of the properties going on across Barbados. They pass around Barbados and see lots and lots of cars on a car lot sitting down in a normal community in Odyssey on Melrose, St. Thomas, next to a little house. Enough cars on a lot and selling cars. He get this money all of a sudden to bring all these cars to sell? You know, the cost of a car, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, but the car lot full. The people in the community driving by in their cars and the bus and stuff know that something ain't right here. As the Trinidadians used to say all the time when we lived in Trinidad, Senator Boyce would tell you, the fish don't start rotting from the tail, Mr. President. And there will come a time when we have to seriously consider granting some kind of immunity to people who assist the police and putting whistleblower provisions in legislation to help bring down the kingpins who are destabilizing the fabric of the Barbadian society. Because without those things, Mr. President, we can only lock up the young, poor black people in Barbados for a long time. And people will benefit from being able to take down whom they perceive as the dons in other communities and run havoc about here. And when, you know, it is really sad. But I do believe that we have to look at it seriously, Mr. President, because if we only get who are going, when we look at it, and Senator Lorenzo spoke about it just now, crimes are not only on the blocks. In fact, the crimes aren't even conceived on those so-called blocks, if you really dive down deep into Barbadian society. For those of us who have canvassed and walked the communities in the length and breadth of Barbados, you know that those blocks are places of recreation. Fellow might smoke a piece of weed on the block, drink some brandy, cuss, maybe be gambling. They might even fight some fowls or dogs down in the back of the bush. That's the most that will happen. But if violent crime is not planned on those blocks, when you see those big wooden things that the electrical wires are brought in on an abandoned fellow sitting down on those things under a tree, that's not really big shooting and thing is being planned. When men are being executed outside Lucky Horseshoe, who are considered to be big kingpins in the trade, that ain't get planned under a tree, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to make the point and to emphasize it that we can never legislate our way out of a social problem. This is too pervasive and too endemic a social problem. And violent crime is a major problem and has been so within the Caribbean for a long time. And don't let us be fooled that all of a sudden now gun violence is this thing shaking in Barbadian fabric. It cools down sometimes and it shifts, but it has always been present. When my last year at school, Mr. President, was in 1993, 29 years ago. And Spice and Company had a song that said, "Too many guns in this town, too many guns passing around. Every day I open the paper, all I read about is murder. It is plain to see it is a shooting spree." The mighty Gabby addressed that in the same year in 1993. He had a song called "Arm the Police, Pow Pow, the gun violence will cease." And a few yards away from where I live in that same year, 3 men who the police alleged were terrorizing Barbados, Brumbright brothers. Senator Rogers will know them early days when he had a fight on campus when the Brumbright brothers turned up. Men trembling and running, going home. People, campus clear out. The F was a nuclear bomb. Senator Rogers, Reverend Dr. Rogers, was not always a theological scholar. He would confess to you, Mr. President, he was a man who did his degree in sciences at that time. Not saying that he was a wild boy, he was always a very decent, upstanding young leader of the university community, and we are very proud of him. But 1993 was a time in Barbados when we were confronted with this issue about guns for the first time, open random shooting. You know what I mean? And I remember Senator John King coming back to the Calypso Arena and penning a song, "How Many More." Woke up early this morning to this song of crying, another mother shedding her tears. So that this has always been part of the society that we have had to circumnavigate. But the problem is that we have been shutting our eyes and condoning that violence itself is a natural corollary to modernization and development. Because as we develop, as we become more sophisticated, as we have more access to technology, it is not, Mr. President, the fellas from down the gap looking through a window at a videotape, watching a Western and cowboy shoot them anymore. Children can access the violence on these smartphones and devices, the video games that they play, all about killing and eliminating. Another Calypsonian who's a friend of mine, Mr. President, spoke about these are the fruits of the Hollywood tree. And the Calypsonians, Mr. President, the point I'm making, have long told us this is a problem that the society faces. But we have always felt that if it is a group of fellows shooting up one another, we put some guns in the police hands, the strong arm, the law will deal with this here, and you know, we will get it on, Barbados is too small. But times have changed, Mr. President. The nature of the engagement of the criminal element has also changed. You know, it's only recently we outfit police to patrol the beaches in things other than the standard police wear. We're behind the times. We're behind the times. So that this relationship between modernization and crime, we've seen the rapid intensification of violence and lawlessness, and also in white-collar corruption too. And don't believe, Mr. President, that the white-collar corruption that goes on in the Caribbean societies is not being viewed by everybody in the society. As long as 40 years ago, another Calypsonian, and Mr. President, I am sorry if I am overindulging in it, because when I was listening to this song about 2 weeks ago, it opened up my mind to a number of things that the Calypsonians were telling us for many, many years. But I'm talking about this relationship between crime and modernization and development. And that it has always been moving, almost in step. And we have always been looking at it, but saying, look, my God, well, the fellas can do something a little different. It is not the old days anymore. But it has outstripped our capacity to respond. And that is why it's shocking and pricking the conscience of the society right now. But as long as about 40 years ago, the sage from St. Philip, the East, the most honorable station in Wilshire, penned a song called We Must Rebuild. And in that song, he first signaled, and this was the 1980s, that there is this connection. And the song began as I look around my country, I see progress. Sometimes I can't believe my eyes in the north, south, east, and west, infrastructure on the rise. And he went on to praise everybody and talk. He said, look, there's a decline in morality affecting this sweet country. It is not like it used to be. Integration and foreign infiltration are what we blame for the corruption. We can have the biggest bank and the fastest highway, but what if the people get it worse every day? Tell me. He penned that in the early 1980s, Mr. President. You could go and listen to that song on YouTube, and you will wonder if he was speaking about today. But, Mr. President, this decline in morality that is affecting the sweet country has continued. There was a time when you were in first form at a secondary school, you had to join cadet scouts or guides, had to play a sport, had to participate in activities, you had to run for your house. You had to be engaged. There had a time when you used to see children going to church on mornings and to Sunday school on evenings. We didn't like it, but it was time to get out the house and have fun. We found time to play cricket, Mr. President, at every opportunity. You can once sweaty, your grandmother won't know where you at church, and you can once sweaty. How we play cricket? So we left the house and play cricket at the church, even the reverend play. No, but this thing, Mr. President, is so pervasive that when you look around, I have a lot of respect for the Scout movement and the work that they are continuing to do in Barbados. Because when I hear the Vice Chancellor, the Vice Chancellor of the universities speaking about the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean have the lowest enrollment rates in tertiary or vocational education in the Western Hemisphere. Well, we don't understand why we are having such a pervasive problem in the Caribbean. And when you look at the university enrollment, it is even worse because the demographic in there tells you you're actually in a class teaching 80% of them are women. Where are the young men in the society? Who is addressing this? If we don't address these problems, and we know that the Honourable Leader of Government Business, Mr. President, began this debate by going right to the heart of the spring, telling you we have an underperforming education sector in Barbados. So you thought, and when I went to school, there was always a room for the middlers, people like me, not the high flyers, you bright people. Senator Elcott was one of the bright ones. Huh? sorry. Well, she know who I mean, Mrs. Elcott then. And there was always a room for the middlers, but they had too many people in our education system then coming out without certification. And the White Paper on Education Reform in the 1990s spoke about 76% of Barbadians leaving school without any certification at all. Has anybody done a study? Or has any recent studies been released? Because if any studies have been done, they will show embarrassingly that we have not bridged that gap in this country. And I'm not going to make a political point because it's not intended to be political. But it was a retrograde step to take away that opportunity for young Barbadians at 18 years old because the government could not afford it. And what you did was to throw a whole set of 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds out into a system where there was no jobs for 4 or 5 years. We are reaping a whirlwind of a society that figured that these things are part of development. And we must, as policymakers, Mr. President, attack this concept, this condonation, that this lifestyle that we are trying to legislate and to deal with by legislation is acceptable as part of the development and the modernization that Barbados must go through. It is not, Mr. President. I would like to call on all Barbados to get to work. Because in Red Plastic by Song, We Must Rebuild, he calls us the architects of our own fate. We are the designers of the Barbados that we want to live in. And I urge people who have never heard this song or who haven't heard it in a long time to go and listen to it. It's very inspiring. In preparation for this debate, Mr. President, I had a conversation with my colleague on the Barbados Cricket Association board who's responsible for youth cricket. And I said to him, very good young man, I said, look, we really got to do something with at-risk youth in Barbados. Let us be the beacon, because I know, and I don't think a lot of people know, but there is no job a 25, 26-year-old can do in the Caribbean, the whole of the Caribbean, unless it's Rihanna, that can earn you more money than cricket. Not Senator Boyce, not Dr. Haynes. It is tax-free too, because the government don't even tax the cricketers. No, in the Caribbean. Why are we not pushing these young people who are on the blocks, aimlessly having nothing to aspire to into sports? I am calling, Mr. President, today on all of the sporting organizations to work with the Sports Council and the government of Barbados in designing a program specifically to target at-risk youth in the schools. The teachers are crying out, they can't do all. I call in also for the business sector in Barbados to return to the days when sports clubs were part and parcel of their operations. Cable and Wireless Sports Club shut down. Banks shut down. Barclays, all in a small area. Texaco down, Webex. There was a time when the businesses in Barbados invested in the social and human capital of their workers. Senator Rogers could tell you there was a time when, and you, Mr. President, know this as well, there was a time when young men left school and walked straight into jobs on the strength of their performances on a cricket football field or a basketball or volleyball court. And young women too. They don't do that anymore. Even the police force had a team. I remember a good friend of mine making the Barbados youth team. I had to make the hard choice of going and join the police force. He went to training school and opted not to go to youth cricket. Respectable police officer to this day. But some might wonder if had he gone and performed, he may have made it, but he made a career choice. But there was a time when the police force and the defense force recruited young, talented sports people across all the disciplines as a means of building the capacity of young people to do things in the society. The decline in morality that is affecting this sweet country is not like it used to be, but we are the architects of this. So that while I support this bill, Mr. President, I'm happy to know that most honourable senators have done so today. There is the consensus that that is not even one-tenth of the way forward. We have a lot of work to do in this country, Mr. President. The gun crime is not going to legislate itself out of existence. We have to create opportunities for young people in the country to do things that are meaningful. And I would stress sports and the arts, because those are the things that I know. And I've seen them work in communities and transform the lives of ordinary people beyond their real expectations. Sir, you and I know people who can hardly speak a word of English, but when they stand on a world stage as a cricketer, and then they become international stars, and then all of a sudden, the academic achievements at school are meaningless because they grow into the character that they become. We need to produce more stars. And this society has to get to work at saving young boys and young girls and working collectively, all in one direction. Mr. President, I'm grateful for the opportunity and I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Nichols. If no more speakers, Senator Collins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to begin by saying thank you to all of the honourable senators who spoke and contributed to this debate. From the opening of the discussion on the debate and the speakers who came immediately afterwards, I'm going to attempt to respond to some of the things, but I don't think that in most instances we expect a response today, because these are all things that we are making recommendations on and can see as part of a society and productive citizens as a part of this society. And so when we started with Senator Hines and ended at Senator Nichols, we acknowledge everywhere in between that we cannot legislate morality. I think there is a former member of parliament who said that famously. You cannot legislate morality. You cannot legislate right or wrong. You can only penalize people who don't know the difference and who fail to follow the norms of society and the laws that have been set in place. But what we have done is we have outlined, both from the government side and from the recommendations made by all of the honourable members of this chamber, we have outlined a comprehensive suite of interventions that include but are not limited to the legislation which is before us, specifically amending the Firearms Act of 1998. We have outlined the importance of social programming. We've outlined the importance of civil society. We've outlined the importance of the church. We've outlined the importance of families. We've outlined the importance of having targeted interventions that go after girls and boys, because, when we talk about what is happening as a crisis with our young men, we acknowledge as well that there are young women who are facilitating and actively participating as willing accomplices to some of the deviant behavior that we are seeing. And we have to be able to treat to what are the constraints, what are the challenges that our young women are facing, that they then find these lifestyles to be attractive and that they are gravitating to that. And so we have to be able to treat to this holistically and comprehensively so that our young people see hope, they see prospects, and they have a future in a Barbados that Senator Andrea Boy said he, as a young person, the youngest person in this Senate, wants to be able to have and to live in for himself, because it is the only Barbados that we have. Mr. President, this is the only Barbados that we all have. This is the Barbados we want for our children and our children's children. And so on that basis, Mr. President, I want to close by calling and echoing the sentiments expressed by all of my colleagues here, that this must be a whole-of-country approach, giving support to our police on the enforcement side, to our families and to our communities, and everyone walking lock in step. I want to acknowledge the comments that were made specifically by Senator Maynard on the references to sporting and the conservation elements. Now, when you spoke about the work that is being done by those persons who are involved in bird shooting and the conservation elements and conservation work that they're doing, that is very much an important contribution to this debate, especially in view of some of the issues that were raised just yesterday in the other place in the comprehensive presentation made by the Minister with responsibility for the environment. Now, Graham Hall Swamp, for example, has historically been known for quite a bit of activity as it relates to bird watching and the highly migratory species that move from here over to Canada, well, to North America more generally, and the introduction of that as part of the conversation, perhaps as a way forward to navigate some of the other issues on how to manage other species humanely may also have been something that I believe that our officials would have heard coming from Senator Maynard, and I want to express appreciation to him for that. So, Mr. President, I now at this time wish to beg that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Honourable senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that you do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolve itself into a committee of the whole for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate dissolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 do now stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 3 stand part.
The question is that Clause 3 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 4 stand part.
I would like to make a comment on 4. I noted it in the debate. So at B, it says in subsection 2, by deleting the word not appearing in the last line, and the word not appears twice in the last line. Removal of both of those will not change the meaning to what I believe the intention is. I believe it is the first not that needs to be removed, and the second one is what should remain. So if you look at the principal legislation, you will see it is 15, that at 15.2, I believe it is. When the commissioner intends not to renew or to revoke a license, he shall give written notice to the license holder of his intention not to renew or to revoke the license, as the case may be, and shall require the license holder to show cause why the license should not be renewed or not be revoked. So I think it should say why the license should be renewed or not be revoked. So this is a person who is saying, don't revoke my license. This is the reason why I should keep my license. Not is in there twice. So that needs to be corrected. I'm saying what I think the correction should be. But even if my correction is wrong, not is in there twice. So there's some clarification as to the not that requires removal. They have 2. And in this, it says that not should be removed. So I am just, oh, you don't want me on this?
Mr. Chairman, I wish to note the recommendation made by the Honourable Senator and to advise that I will share the concern raised with the Attorney General, with the Office of the CPC, but more principally with the Law Review Commission, because if we look at the principal legislation, there are notes there as well as what has been put in the amendment, and I would not wish to make amendments from the floor of the Senate without knowing or understanding the intent of the drafters, and so we will refer it back to the drafters for any edits that need to be made before final proclamation. I beg to move that clause 4 do stand part.
Just a question. What does that mean for us actually saying yes or no to this clause? Because as it stands, I'm not clear as to this amendment. Whether the not has to stay in there, whether we are accepting this 4B, or we are recommending that it be removed or something of the sort. So how are we going to vote on this without having the clarity that you seek? Pardon? So it is okay for us to vote on this even though we are not clear as to what the amendment is actually trying to do?
Mr. President, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, please.
When there are disagreements as to the linguistic canons used in legislative texts, this tradition has always been to refer it to the Law Review Commission, where there are queries raised at the bill by committee stage. I don't know if the standing orders precludes the bill from proceeding thereafter. The query or objection, I shouldn't call it an objection because it's only an objection if it is voted as one. But the query would then be noted and considered. There's a duty of the public officer who form part of that process, coming from here, to answer the query. If the query is satisfied, then it comes back for revision in a form that would require an amendment. But in other words, I think what the Honourable Leader is suggesting that you have the undertaking of the government that we would consider the query, take it to the Attorney General's office and to confirm. I believe also we will be duty bound to report back to the Honourable Senator who raised the query as to how that exercise has transpired.
Senator Maynard. The question is that clause 4 stand part. Honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it, but the no has been noted.
Clause 5.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 5 stand part.
The question is that clause 5 stand part. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 6.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 6 stand part.
The question is that clause 6 stand part. All honourable members in favour, senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 7.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 7 stand part.
The question is that clause 7 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 8.
Mr. President, I beg to move that clause 8 stand part.
The question is that clause 8 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 9.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 9 stand part.
The question is that Clause 9 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methink the ayes have it.
Clause 10.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 10 stand part.
The question is that Clause 10 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methink the ayes have it.
Clause 11.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clause 11 stand part.
The question is that Clause 11 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methink the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the
Excuse me.
passing of one bill in committee.
May I ask a question before we go back to there? Do I stand? Okay. I just want to understand what we just did. I would just like your guidance before we go back. So it is absolutely clear to everyone in here, I believe, that Clause 4, Section B, we do not know what the meaning of that is, because it refers to deleting the word not appearing in the last line of subsection 2. Subsection 2 does not have the word not in it. The last line does not have the word not in it. The line before it has two words not. And we have just voted to approve this. The ayes have it, sir. I just want to understand what is our purpose of voting upon that, since we do not understand what it says. It cannot be figured out. What's the point of what are we doing with this? Why are we voting yes to something that you do not know what it says? I'm not trying to be difficult. I just would like us to understand what is our role here. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move the suspension of the sitting for 10 minutes, just for the purpose of consultation.
You have to ask.
Based on my request, Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do not leave the chair and allow the president of the chamber to return.
The question is that I do now leave the chair for the return of the president. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against?
The chairman has reported progress and asks for leave to sit again. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move a motion to have a suspension of the sitting of the Senate for 10 minutes.
The question is that this sitting be suspended for 10 minutes, that is until 5:50 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Honourable senators against, please say no. Methink the ayes have it. We stand suspended until 5:50 p.m.